Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar session on addressing responsivity issues with criminal justice-involved Native Americans. My name is Kim Cobb, and I'm a project director at the American Probation and Parole Association, and I will be moderating today's webinar session. We have a great team of presenters lined up today, including Ada Melton, President of American Indian Development Associates, Brian Colgan, Supervisor U.S. Probation Officer from the District of Arizona, and Adrian Lindsay, Research Specialist Senior at Arizona State University Center for Applied Behavioral Health Policy. This webinar is being presented today through grant funding from the Bureau of Justice Assistance. APPA would like to thank BJA for their continued support of APPA to provide training, technical assistance, and opportunities for peer-to-peer information sharing, such as today's webinar, to further the development and enhancement of community corrections programs in tribal jurisdictions. I'd like to go over just a couple of quick items before we get started with today's discussion. All participants will remain muted for today's discussion to avoid any feedback or background noise. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for continued access and viewing on the APPA website within a few days. The PowerPoint will also be made available following the broadcast so that you will have access to all the valuable information and resources presented today. Also, we will be allowing time at the end of today's broadcast to answer questions. You can submit your questions anytime during the webinar via the question feature. If we are unable to answer all the questions during the live broadcast, we will forward the questions in queue to the presenters and respond to you via email, but we'll try to get to as many questions as we can today. Also, should you have any technical difficulties accessing the webinar today, you may let us know through the chat or messaging feature. We have some great content to get to, so let's get started. The National Institute of Corrections and the Crime and Justice Institute has developed what's commonly referred to as evidence-based practices for effective intervention. Within that model, a framework commonly referred to as the R&R model or risk-need responsivity model has emerged. The R&R model directs community corrections practitioners to determine who requires more of their time and attention and resources, what their criminogenic needs and stabilizing needs are, and how best to address those needs based on individual specific and general responsivity factors. What we know is that Native American offenders are involved in justice systems across jurisdictions, sometimes having cases pending in multiple systems concurrently. Yet there has not been systemic efforts to address the unique needs and circumstances that should be informing how they're assessed, how their needs may differ from other populations, and how their responsivity factors influence supervision and treatment outcomes, and the impact of their culture on all of these things. While identifying risk and needs are critical pieces, careful consideration of responsivity factors and having the flexibility to react based on these responsivity factors is where community corrections can see some significant positive outcomes when working with tribal members who are on their supervision caseloads. So we know that there has not been a risk and need assessment tool that's been validated for this population, and that's a significant oversight since most of the probation and parole work needs to be based on those risk and need assessment tools. Programs incorporating culture or that's built upon cultural values or methods and practices have not received sufficient evaluation to be considered evidence-based practices. And we know that there's a limited inclusion of Native American individuals involved in criminal justice-related studies. So these are just some of the areas that we're going to be addressing today through this webinar. So when we talk about the responsivity principle, it's important to define what we're talking about. Responsivity refers to targeting interventions and services according to each individual offender. It's one of the principles of evidence-based practices, and personally I think this is one of the most important principles, specifically relating to facilitating behavior change. So often we see individuals either unsuccessful on supervision or we see them cycling through over and over again and think either that they're just being willfully non-compliant or they just can't keep it together once the supervision period ends. However, it may be that the service or intervention may not be matching their individual responsivity factors. So there are three kinds of responsivity factors identified within the evidence-based practices. The first is referred to as offender character traits. This includes things such as gender, temperament, culture, motivation, learning style, intelligence, mental illness, all of the things that can have a profound impact on how people receive services. Some of what we're going to talk about today is how connection to culture may impact supervision outcomes. The second kind of responsivity refers to the traits of the individual working with a person on supervision. So that could be a treatment provider, it could be the probation officer. And this refers to your supervision style and your personality style. So an example of this could be if you're a very extroverted personality, high energy, have a fast pace of doing things, supervising someone who is extremely introverted may be intimidating. There is research which states that the relationship between an individual on supervision and their officer or treatment provider can influence their outcomes by over 40%. So this is an important factor to pay attention to. The last type of responsivity relates to the program components. If an individual has a low reading comprehension level, assigning them to a program that is workbook-based may not be successful. Again, or someone who is very shy or introverted may not be successful in a group-oriented program. In most jurisdictions, having a menu of different options is or can be difficult, but knowing the impact responsivity factors can have on the outcomes of individuals on supervision should prompt officers to do their best in matching them to the right programs to help them be successful. So since we know that county, state, federal, tribal, and private community corrections officers all work with Native American populations, this team of presenters decided to leverage the APPA membership to get realistic input into what they see the Native Americans on their supervision caseload, how their responsivity factors play into the supervision process, and also learn more about how they were taking it upon themselves, either as an individual or at their agency level, to become more knowledgeable about what works with this population. So in April, APPA and AIDA, the American Indian Development Associates, launched a survey to APPA membership to get their input on these issues. So we had a total of about 435 individuals that responded to the survey. I've been a part of a lot of surveys in the past, and typically respondents will answer those closed-ended questions, but they don't leave a lot of narrative. We had such an overwhelming response to this survey narratively. We had so much qualitative feedback that we decided to write an article for federal probation based on this response. So I just wanted to take a minute and highlight a few of those responses to kind of set the tone for the rest of the webinar. So we asked respondents if they believed there were general responsivity factors or programs and services that work best with individuals as a group or a population. As you can see, 51% of respondents indicated yes, that they did believe there were general responsivity factors for Native Americans. As you can see from the comments, many indicated that when programs and services are tied to the culture or spiritual beliefs of their tribe, they feel like the interventions are more successful. Additionally, respondents felt that when officers and programs are more knowledgeable about the roles of families, ceremonies, the different communication styles, and the tribal history, that it builds trust and promotes trust and respect and allows that probation and that probation officer to be successful. So of the respondents that indicated no, that they did not feel like there were general responsivity factors, they stated that, I thought it was interesting that they stated that there was not enough research on this population, or that the population was not represented well enough in the research to say that these factors existed conclusively. And so that was one of the things we highlighted in this article, was that there just wasn't enough research about this population. So another question we asked related to specific responsivity factors, and that's that individual personal factors that can enhance treatment or supervision. Many of the respondents indicated that it's important to gauge how important the connection to the tribe is for these individuals on your caseload, and make recommendations based upon that information. Additionally, some reported that the needs may be different based on whether a person lives on or off the reservation. They also identified connectivity to things such as their culture, their ceremonies, their spiritual beliefs, and how much they felt like they were connected to their tribe, as well as how involved their family was. Other factors that they cited included the impact of generational or alcohol substance abuse, a lack of trust when working with non-tribal agencies, different communication styles, fetal alcohol syndrome, and then transportation issues was listed as a big barrier to supervision and treatment. So I think the feedback that we received from the field matched what the literature is putting out there regarding the need to target more research into the risk, need, and responsivity factors for this population in order to increase positive outcomes, no matter what system or systems they may be involved in. So now I'm going to turn it over to Brian Colgan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Along with the article that we'll be discussing today, the lead article in the September 2014 issue of Federal Probation dealt with responsivity in a more global sense, and that was by Guy Bourgon and Jim Bonta. And they offered a operational sort of definition of responsivity, that once responsivity is about how we promote client engagement and client learning most efficiently and most effectively. And so as we think about responsivity with this particular population, there's these parallel issues of efficiency and effectiveness. And to summarize that article before we go into more detail about how this relates to the population we're talking about, I think they make some really good points, and this next slide kind of summarizes what they came up with. That change requires learning, learning requires engagement, engagement requires a relationship. If there's no relationship, there's not going to be engagement. If there's not engagement, there's not going to be learning. And if there's no learning, there's not going to be any change. So ultimately, with this population involved in the criminal justice system, change is still an outcome that we're desiring. Now we're trying to adjust our approaches with methods and techniques that make our work more effective, but still gauging towards or aiming towards this idea of change. So if we're going to promote that change with the people that we're supervising that are Native Americans, their learning of new skills and new ways to problem solve are still important. Their engagement in the process is still important. The relationship building piece is really important. So on the next slide in our article, we cite some work by Hossinger and others back in 2006 that talked about the added significance of one-on-one contacts between officers and justice-involved Native Americans. They make the point that extra care needs to be given both to all three of these areas: relationship building, communication styles, and understanding the culture and terminology associated with this person. So the rest of this presentation is going to focus on these three areas. And first, I'm going to talk a little bit about that piece of officer traits or characteristics in terms of maybe some skill building that we can consider looking at going forward as we attempt to be more effective with this population. So before we launch into that, what is culture? Because that's going to come up throughout this discussion. And a pretty general description of that is it's based on the attitudes and behavioral characteristics of a particular group. And that typically, when you start to peel that back, that gets you down towards roles, expectations, boundaries, and it really serves as a frame of reference for people as they move through life and engage in relationships. So the next slide is kind of a picture of that dichotomy between the traits of the person on supervision and our traits. And as we look at the right-hand side there, how we approach the interaction is something within our control. And if we're asking ourselves, what can we do to build more effective relationships, especially with this population, that's what we're going to try and answer, at least in this next little segment of the webinar. So in the next slide, we're going to get into this area of core correctional practices. And that's been written about and discussed back since 79 and 80. You can see that there from Don Andrews. Was really the first to start to put a lot of these concepts together in terms of traits or behaviors that officers can engage in that will make the likelihood of learning and change more likely with those that we're supervising. So that curriculum's been put together in different jurisdictions. In Canada, it's called STICS. Chris Trotter's work in Australia is working with involuntary clients. University of Cincinnati has EPICS. Our federal system has STARR. So it's kind of an alphabet soup here of different curriculums. So on the next slide, within this framework of core correctional practices, there's these kind of two constellation of skills. And we're going to focus on a particular skill in a minute that helps officers build better relationships. And in this area of core correctional practices, when they start talking about effective relationships, here's some of the traits that are associated with that: warmth, empathy, enthusiastic, non-blaming communication. On the next slide, this is core correctional practices is very firmly rooted in risk needs responsivity model and the research around that, and it's something that's been evaluated and implemented in Australia, in Great Britain, in Canada, and here in the United States. And so along with that core correctional practice study and others' work in the area of relationships and how they relate to outcomes, we wanted to draw attention to this one quote from a recent meta-analysis of core correctional practices, that the research suggests that when a relationship between an officer and a client is characterized as caring, warm, enthusiastic, combined with respect, fairness, and trust, the relationship can reduce the likelihood of recidivism. And so that's what's driving us in a general sense to look at this idea of improving relationships. On the next slide, the second piece of core correctional practices is kind of considered structuring skills. We're not going to go into that today, but those things include reinforcement, problem solving, and skill building. So we're back to the original slide from Hossinger that points to the extra care needs to be given to relationship building. That's the part of the equation that us as officers can control, and that relationship building, communication styles, and understanding culture and terminology are even more important when we're talking about justice-involved Native Americans. So on the next slide is just highlights the work by Chris Trotter working with involuntary clients. And this idea of role clarification that we're going to go over here briefly is really based on his work in Australia. So definition of role clarification, kind of the basis for why it's important. The research suggests that role clarification should be viewed as one of the key skills in working with involuntary clients, and that definitely applies to the population of Native American or justice-involved tribal members that we're working with. On the next slide, outcomes are improved for involuntary clients when workers focus on helping them to understand the roles of the worker and the client. So that idea of role can kind of linking back to the idea of culture, and what our role is important to explain to someone and then to understand from that person. In this case, we're talking about individuals who are Native Americans, to understand how culture plays a role in their expectations and the things that their views towards us. So I think next is a poll that Kim put together, and see how the technology works here. So the question is, during initial meeting with a new probationer, are you asking them what they want to accomplish while on supervision? So if you could just pick an answer there, that never, sometimes, or always. We're just curious on how often during your intakes you're asking the person you're working with about their goals, things they want to accomplish while they're on supervision. Okay, so a little over half are always doing, sometimes about a third, and less than 10% are never asking about goals. Well, that's great, because one of the fundamental elements of this role clarification process within core correctional practices is this idea of trying to connect to the person's goals and try and see how they potentially overlap with the person's criminogenic needs to help us refine our focus. So we move on to the next slide. And maybe it bears kind of pausing and taking a breath at this point to just touch back with what we're trying to accomplish here. You know, webinars usually present a lot of information, and that's very valuable. It helps inform us to be wiser in how we do our work. What we're going to look at now is a specific skill that officers can use during the intake process and even during subsequent contacts to help guide them through the process of orientating someone to supervision that's in a structured way that helps them get an idea of what to expect while on supervision and what the supervision process looks like. So in Trotter's work, the slide's kind of depicting there what it involves in terms of role clarification, that it's ongoing discussions about the purpose of supervision, their goals, the dual role of the officer in terms of maintaining boundaries that the court has set forth, and also providing assistance for the person on supervision. Discussions around those boundaries on how our authority plays a role and what the court's authority is in terms of those boundaries as well. And the last piece of it typically gets into confidentiality. So on the next slide, what you see are 5 outline points, or as we refer to them in the STARR curriculum as skill steps. So these are steps that officers are learning in the federal system. About half the officers in supervision function in the federal probation system have been exposed to these skills and are beginning to incorporate them into their work. So the first step is to simply identify what the agency's goals are. And this could be done in the format of some open-ended questions you could ask. So what have you heard are the reasons that the probation office exists? What have you heard that we're trying to do with people? And the benefit of using an open-ended question here, and Adrian's going to talk more about the use of MI and how it relates to the relationship building process. But the benefits of using open-ended questions at this point is you start to hear from the person what their preconceived notions are, what they've understood to be the case about your agency and why they're on supervision and what that supervision is about. So then you can address it and clarify if there's some mistaken information that they have. So after you have that discussion with them, then you move on to a discussion about their goals. And simply this could happen by saying, you know, you're going to be on supervision for a couple years that the judge has ordered. Tell me in the next couple years some of the things that you want to accomplish in your life. So again, a chance to ask an open-ended question and starting to collect information from the person that starts to build collaboration around what's important to them. Again, the subtext of this being we want to build a relationship, and to have a relationship with someone you have to have some shared understanding. So then step 3 of this process is for us to identify what our role with the officer is. And again, this is an opportunity maybe to ask this person, hey, what have you heard about probation officers? What have you heard that they are trying to do with the people that they supervise? So we could get some surprising information there across the spectrum of maybe, you know, trying to lock people up, or maybe we'll hear that we're trying to help. So it's important to hear for that person what it is they think our role is. So then in step 4 of this process, we turn the conversation to defining elements of supervision, what's negotiable, what's not negotiable. And a lot of times the example that we use in training is it's negotiable when you come see me, but it's not negotiable for you to fail to report as directed. So having clarity around those boundaries that the people have starts to build some confidence, hopefully, with that person, and some trust that, okay, they know what to expect. And again, hearkening back to that idea of roles and expectations are very important elements in forming an effective collaborative relationship. And then also too in the step 4 to address the roles of the people involved in the supervision process, including the treatment providers, the court, and anyone else that might be involved. And then this last piece are what are the boundaries around confidentiality? Who's going to have access to the information we're discussing, again, to build trust and confidence so they know what happened. So making clear of our duty to warn and our duty to report when those things are triggered. So person knows up front that if we're party to some information that puts them at risk or that they're putting someone else at risk, that we have a responsibility to report that. So those 5 steps are what constitute what we refer to as the skill role clarification. And this is a very practical way that community corrections professionals around the world now are learning to start the supervision process off with having this discussion in this format, in this order, along this structure to help them start to build the relationship with the person on supervision and build it in a way that's more collaborative by evoking from them what their goals are. So a little bit more research about role clarification. In Trotter and others' work, they found that a worker's focus on the potential consequences of not complying with conditions from the court order often related to poorer outcomes. And on the other hand, helping clients to understand the purpose of the intervention and what was negotiable and was not negotiable related to better outcomes. And ultimately, our work is trying to focus on improving outcomes, and this idea of role clarification is something that is more and more being found to be a helpful way for us to build these relationships. So again, the skill steps are on the next slide. And again, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that it's a structured way for an officer to have an interaction with someone who's new to supervision, but not just new to supervision. The person's goals that you'll get from them in step 2 are something you can refer back to throughout the process. And so to promote understanding, to promote a relationship, these 5 skill steps are designed to help do that. And as the research on the next slide, again, referring back to Hossinger, the idea of how important relationship building can be to this population. So we're going to switch gears now. I'm going to turn it over to Adrienne Lindsay, and she's going to address this topic of communication styles.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So I'm going to speak a little bit to motivational interviewing specifically and how that can help to improve both communication styles, as Brian mentioned, but also that relationship piece for Native Americans that are involved in the criminal justice system. So we wanted to start out with a poll question here to kind of get a sense of, how many of you are maybe utilizing MI and how comfortable you feel with motivational interviewing, to kind of get a read on the group before we jump into this topic. So how comfortable are you using motivational interviewing? Your options are, I'm not familiar with the style, or maybe you're familiar with it but you're not comfortable utilizing MI, or maybe you're somewhat comfortable using the style, or you feel very proficient. Give everyone a minute or so to respond. Okay, so it looks like about half of you feel maybe somewhat comfortable, about a third of you feel pretty proficient, maybe you've had a lot of exposure to MI, maybe you've had a lot of practice with MI, and then a little over 10% of the group sounds like you're not at all familiar with MI. Okay, and in that case we'll point some of you fall into that 11% to some additional resources at the end of this section. So why are we talking about motivational interviewing? Well, one, it's an evidence-based practice that we have a rather robust and long-standing, really 20 to 30 years of literature to support its effectiveness. So we have about 180 plus randomized controlled trials demonstrating its effectiveness. So as you all know, I'm sure randomized controlled trials are really kind of that gold standard in research. So really we see outcomes with MI on par with a variety of other evidence-based practices like CBT and others. So how does it apply to Native Americans on supervision or involved with the criminal justice system in some capacity, we see that motivational interviewing is fairly culturally congruent with a variety of Native American populations, and maybe for a few reasons. One is sort of the style's respect for a person's autonomy. So that's really kind of their decision to make a change or not make a change, what that change might look like, exploring all of their options, but really kind of putting the person back in the driver's seat, and for the officer to sort of step out of kind of that expert role. But also avoiding confrontation. So this is really more of a collaborative style. We won't have an opportunity today, just given our time together, to get into all the ins and outs of the style, but really it wouldn't involve any confrontation, despite maybe certain behaviors that someone might be engaging in. Also an emphasis on listening. So in an MI style, we would be talking a lot less. The person we're interviewing or conversing with would be talking hopefully a little more than us. And then also this focus on respect. In MI, sometimes we refer to it as acceptance. Just sort of accepting where the person currently is. Doesn't necessarily mean we respect or condone all behaviors, but ultimately have a mutual respecting relationship. And so while the literature on motivational interviewing with Native Americans is a little bit limited, as Kim mentioned in the beginning of our talk today, we do see demonstrated effectiveness in a few areas: smoking cessation, reducing alcohol consumption, increasing HIV testing rates, and then reductions in fetal alcohol syndrome. And I want to point everyone to one large, robust meta-analysis conducted by Hatima and colleagues. So this was 72 randomized clinical trials comparing MI to other styles, often comparing MI to more maybe confrontational styles. And the researchers were really surprised to find that MI had 2 to 3 times the effect size with ethnic minority clients as it did white or Caucasian clients. And this effect was really pronounced with Native American clients. It's about 3 times the effect size. So just something to be keeping in mind, that it may be even more critical that we use a style like motivational interviewing when we're dealing with Native Americans, particularly Native Americans or others who have their autonomy impeded in some way, such as having some criminal justice involvement. So I want to point everyone to one study by McMurran. So this is a summary, or this is a review rather, of some of the MI literature dealing particularly with offenders. So as Kim noted earlier in the webinar, this is also an area that could certainly grow a bit in terms of the amount of literature we have with this population. But McMurran was looking at 13 peer-reviewed MI studies and 6 dissertations, 10 of which were randomized controlled trials. And there did seem to be an impact on a variety of change goals, things like reducing substance use, reducing domestic violence, reducing recidivism. And the participants showed an improvement in their readiness to change, or their motivation, in 8 to 10 studies that looked at that variable, and then also a reduction in their substance use in 3 to 4 of those studies. So we have a large body of literature on MI and substance abuse. That's really sort of where MI sprung up from. But I wanted to point everyone to this particular review that's specific to criminal justice populations. And another study I wanted to reference by Harper and Hardy, they were looking at male and female probationers. Most had some kind of alcohol or drug-related charge. And here they were comparing officers who were using an MI style or who'd been trained in an MI style to officers who were maybe just using their usual supervision style. And they found that the group of probationers that was exposed to the officers who were utilizing MI showed significant improvements in criminal thinking, anticipating rearrest or reincarceration, and even just their general perception of their personal problems or kind of life problems. And also found a reduction in drug and alcohol use for those probationers that were in the MI group. So I want to say a little bit about how we might go about learning MI. It looked like from the poll questions about half of you feel pretty proficient or comfortable, or whether it was half of you felt comfortable. So maybe there's a half or so of you that feel like you have a little more to learn. So if we're thinking about how we might go about learning MI, I want to point you to a study by Bill Miller and Terry Moyers. So if those names don't sound familiar to you, they're out of New Mexico. They're thought to be sort of the founders of motivational interviewing. And they wanted to look at what types of trainings are effective when people, are seeking to learn MI or become more proficient in MI. So they conducted a randomized control trial with 140 trainees looking at different forms of MI learning. Those who only read a manual on MI, at 4 months out from reading that manual, only 22% could really demonstrate those MI skills. 37% could demonstrate proficiency in MI 4 months out if they just went to a workshop. So the majority of us, if we just go to a training, say on MI or one-day workshop, something like that, in this case it was a 2-day workshop, are actually going to be able to kind of demonstrate or utilize those skills going forward. A little over half the sample could demonstrate strong MI skills 4 months out if they went to the workshop and received some feedback on their work. So this was in the form of an email, or kind of written communication around their MI skills that were demonstrated in the training, or coaching, which was telephonic coaching, about half an hour in length. The group that seemed to best be able to demonstrate those MI skills a number of months out from that workshop were those that both went to the workshop, received the feedback, the written feedback by email, and that received the telephonic coaching. I think there were 6 sessions. So what we see here is that it might be critical to have some form of ongoing coaching, ongoing MI supervision, or some form of feedback or feedback loop about our MI skills. That it may not be sufficient to just go to a workshop, even if that workshop is provided by Bill Miller. You probably don't get much better than that in terms of an MI training. Next slide. So if you're thinking about what to do next, and of course, a lot of our jurisdictions are kind of working with limited funds in terms of training funds. A good first step can certainly be going to a training or workshop, and that's probably what most of us have done. That can be a good initial step in terms of just building some awareness, but as we just looked at in the last slide, that may not equate to sort of long ongoing proficiency in MI. So a good starting place, but then we might think about kind of looking at our own work, taking a deeper look at that. Maybe getting some feedback from, say, a supervisor, or if you have, say, an MI in-house MI coach or an in-house MI trainer. So that could come about in a number of ways. You could, say, record an interview with a supervisee. Little digital handheld recorders are fairly inexpensive, or a lot of us have the capacity to create recordings on, say, our phones or our tablets. If your jurisdiction had some restrictions around making a recording with a supervisee, you could certainly just do that with a colleague, talk about some kind of behavior the person wants to change. We would usually recommend what we call a real play as opposed to a role play where you're talking about a real issue, so it's a little, mimics a real interaction a little better. And if you couldn't record something, you could just have someone who's maybe a little more proficient in MI than yourself just sit in and watch an interaction that you have with the supervisee and give you some feedback afterwards on how that went. And then, of course, we can also get feedback from the people we're working with, how they feel the relationship is going, how motivated they're feeling, just generally creating a feedback loop for them as well. And then lastly, participating in some kind of ongoing MI supervision. So this could be with the supervisor, or in some agencies, groups have developed sort of a learning circle type format where maybe a handful of people, 6, 7, 8 people who are interested in learning more about MI or want to become more proficient in MI sort of get together, maybe do some case consultation type work, or even just practicing the skills with one another. So I want to point everyone to a couple resources that are specific to working with Native Americans, but more importantly, maybe how would we weave, say, Native American culture in with motivational interviewing, and what does sort of that balance look like? So these are two free manuals available online. Perhaps this is something we could send out with the slides as well, or if not, people are welcome to get in touch with me. I have copies of both of these, and I'm happy to share them. So again, as our time is limited today, we can't delve too deep into the MI principles, but this could certainly be a good starting place, in particular how you might start to apply MI with your Native American supervisees. And now I will turn it over to Ada.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And as if you've heard from all of our presenters, one of the things that we're really trying to do is help everybody on their journey towards having a culturally relevant model for how to work with individuals on your caseloads. So things that have been pointed out are relationships, the importance of having those relationships, the importance of having a good communication style that fits well with the people that you're working with. If one of our goals is to be assistive, then we really need to be able to know how to communicate well. And one of the really important things that we also need to do as officers is just to be as culturally informed as possible, and to be able to understand the environment from which these people that we're working with that are American Indian or Alaska Native, that we really try to be as informed as possible. Now, some of us that are American Indian or Alaska Native will have probably an easier time going about that, but we know that many people on our caseloads are being managed by folks that are not. And so one of the things that we can only hope to do is to try to really make sure that people become well informed. And so what we're hoping to be able to do here is to have and be able to give those skills that are necessary for officers in the field, for your people that are line staff, people that are administrators, people that are policymakers, to be able to know what we're talking about, because culture and being culturally relevant, using cultural belief systems, mechanisms can sometimes be really abstract to people that haven't been or that are not Native American or have not been around people that are from a different culture. So as far as that goes, we really want to be able to point out things that are important. And the reason why we want to be documenting these things is to really create an environment where these practices become institutionalized. That when I was a probation officer, it was very much a relationship, but when I left, a lot of the things that we had worked on went away. And so while it was great for me, the people that came after me, they didn't have a lot to build upon. And so it's really important for us to be thinking about ways that we can institutionalize these different practices with policy so that the practice can go on, so they can become part of job performance measurements and all those kinds of things. So what we really want to be able to do is just look at and have ways that we honor the different cultural strengths that clients might come from. Their specific places that they might be from, the specific tribes that they might be from. And to really be able to understand how that we can use culture as a way to deal with interventions and healing, as a way for problem solving, as a way for using some of the things that might be really important for people to gain or regain their status in their communities, such as traditional restitution or cultural education. So as we're going along, in our next slide, we want to be able to identify ways that we can incorporate culture. And these are things that we want to be saying to our policy and administrators and people that we're working with, and perhaps even tribes that you might be wanting to engage, that what are the purposes for incorporating culture? Well, one of it is to heighten awareness by everyone, including the clients that you might have, the individuals that you are supervising. When we're talking about responsivity and what that means, we really want to be able to use things that are relevant in a person's life, to be able to address some of those unique factors. Sometimes where a person is can really reduce the cost of things that we want to be able to use. Community-based resources from where the person is living might be really important for us. And so I think it takes effort on both sides of the agencies that we're working with that are either tribal-based or that are state-based or even federal-based agencies. I think everybody needs a fair amount of cultural education and awareness and skill building. And again, we're moving towards informing people so that on their journey to becoming competent, we have things that they can really take a look at on understanding culture. Sometimes it's really important that if we're going to advocate for our clients or to be of assistance, we really need to be able to know how we can use some of the cultural rights and privileges that a person has in order to use some of the resources that might be available from a person's tribe. One of the really important things I think also is that when we become culturally informed and helping to create plans, it helps us to be able to address things that might not be things that we can do with mainstream or Western style approaches. Some of the things that I'm thinking about that I've dealt with in the past is just how do we deal with, how do we ask for help from a tribe? What are the tribal protocols? What are the ceremonies that we need to or would like to use for healing purposes? What are the ways that we would ask for help? Is there a traditional payment? Are there protocols that a person might need to have, our client might need to have? How do we prepare them for access to those things? For instance, if we wanted to use tribal peacemaking, how would a person go about asking for that? Maybe that's one of the requirements that a tribe might want to have, because some of the folks that are on our caseloads are coming out of prison. They might have been in prison for a long period of time. Some people might be in jail-based facilities. How do we help them gain their status or their place back in the community? And so what we might need to know are what are some of the tribal protocols that are in place. Earlier, Adrienne pointed to practices that are researched. A lot of the things that we're talking about in this next slide are things that we look at in terms of culture. There are a lot of things that have been researched in mainstream America, and MI motivational interviewing is one of those areas, but a lot of the things that we depend on in terms of culture and cultural practices or cultural beliefs haven't been researched or evaluated in a way that they would meet what's often referred to as the gold standard. Or things that we might want to be wanting to replicate. And so we have another way of looking at things that are out there in tribal communities is a model that's gaining a lot of momentum in tribes, and it's called practice-based evidence. And a lot of the reasons why this really fits for Indian communities is because some of the things that we really want to do, like sweats, or spirituality, or just dealing with some of the beliefs that tribes have, may be things that have been in place from time immemorial, but they just haven't been evaluated. And so as we move to the next slide, we want to be able to think about how could we use these practice-based evidence resources that are out there. In what ways would we want to be able to use these? And for instance, in interventions, How could we use traditional counseling? How could we use traditional healing with tribal medicine men and women? How would we be able to use sweats, fasting, smudging, those kinds of things that are really important in many tribal cultures? And also, people that are returning to communities might really have to rely on problem solving that comes from the way that the tribe does this. And so, again, there's a lot of tribes that still have indigenous justice practices in place. They follow peacemaking, peacekeeping strategies, using talking circles, family gatherings, ways to restore relationships that might have been damaged while the person was engaged in their crimes or wrongdoing that got them into a justice system or got them on probation. So it's really important for us to be looking at these things. As we go along to the next, we really just want to be able to look at ways that tribes are doing these. There may be even things in the community that are happening, like for instance, green farming. There were a couple of tribes that were doing this kind of work in the youth arena that we have been evaluated, and some of those things that are promising practices for them are really important for us to be able to capture. So when we start thinking about what we want to be able to do with tribes, we want to be aware of how we access this information. What are the things, in the next slide we'll see are ways that we can access cultural information. Again, if we're on a journey of becoming informed, we really need to be able to look at who are the cultural experts in our community. Adrienne mentioned coaching. Cultural experts can really help in the way that perhaps you're interviewing, who to identify that could actually help you do interviews in the community or to help you learn about the community. Accessing oral traditions. Again, tribes have different ways of knowing, and it's really important for us to be able to see who and how we could create that. And of course, the written history, elders in the community, and borrowing from other tribes. I think these are all really important things that, as we think about how we apply the use of culture in our next slide, we want to be able to help tribes, to help officers and individuals that are on our caseloads. Some may really need to learn tribal basics of tribal life ways, different knowledge, skills, and abilities that they might need to have. Some of our clients may have been removed, or if they've been incarcerated for a long time, they might really need some training themselves about what the tribal life ways are and resources that are in their community. They might really need to learn back again spirituality and healing practices and all those things that are important for people to have. In our next slide, we'll look at some of the things that are challenges, things that make it hard for us to be able to use culture. Sometimes it's just our ability to access this information. Time and resources might be really difficult for us. There may be competing interests or cultural differences that exist. For some tribes, there may not be readiness issues that enable, for instance, policies and procedures may not exist for some tribes, or some agencies may not have these things that will support your effort to become culturally informed. More and more, we need intergovernmental relationships that are solidified by memorandums of agreements or interagency agreements. Sometimes some of the things that we might want to do for one tribal person and another, or if we wanted to have a full program, we might really need to make sure that what we want to do, are sweats the right thing to do in a place where sweats are not used predominantly. We just want to make sure that we have cultural fidelity for some of the things and that they're appropriate for the population that you're working with. Again, I think outreach is really important as we think about ways to make our programs be relevant in their way of using culture. It's really important in our next slide that we look at what levels of programming do we need to have. One really important thing is just we need to have staff that's knowledgeable, staff that is informed. A lot of us will not ever be fully culturally competent in everything that we do for every tribe that we have, but to the extent that we can really make an effort in doing that, that's really important. Our interventions have to be really culturally relevant and appropriate. And this takes a little bit of homework. In the next slide, we'll look at some of the things that are important for us that can help us start on our way. And what this guidance is, in the next slide, is just building on strategies that we can bring in program design that will help us to work with tribal folks. Individuals that are not from the tribe might not be able to understand some of the things that are important. We need to be able to have ways to talk with one another. As was mentioned, communication is really important. We need to be able to have protocols to work with different clients that are on our caseloads for short periods of time, medium time, long periods of time, so that we will be able to be as responsive as possible. In our next slide, there's some things that you can do that are available to you right now. One of the things that I do, no matter where and what level of work that we're doing, is creating tribal community profiles. A lot of this information is available to us right off of tribal websites. You can get tribal demographics, you can get an understanding of economic factors, the government structure. All of these different points are just things that you can use to make yourself and be prepared for the different tribal agencies or tribal communities that you might be working with to help your client. And becoming really informed yourself demonstrates to everybody, including clients and the tribes that you're working with, that you are vested in becoming culturally informed and helping people to get where they need to in the way of changing and making changes in their lives. I just want to close with this next slide that talks about guidelines. I think one of the really important things that we really want to be able to do is to make sure that we have strategies for institutionalizing our practice. And I can't say enough about how important that is to consult with the tribal governments that you have in your communities, in your states. Some of us have a lot of tribes and some of us only have a few tribes. And I think that these guidelines are meant for that, so that if we're wanting to be more culturally relevant and appropriate and including responsiveness into the way that we work with tribes, then we need to have guidelines. If we do that, the things that we can expect from cultural programming is that we'd have an increase in the next slide, Kim, that we'd have more collaborative planning. We'd have a lot more people helping us to be culturally relevant, to make sure that the services that we have are germane to the community that we're serving, that there's a whole lot of collaboration going on between tribal and community-based cultural resources. And that you have other people that are not the conventional people that you see from an agency, that you have people from the community that you can work with. And that we really move towards using this to institutionalize the services and programs, and that we increase that human capital that has this expertise. With that, I'll give it back to Kim. I know it's a lot that we've talked about, but we really are happy that we were able to get this information to everyone.
Okay, thank you, Ada and Brian and Adrian, for those presentations. We'll now kind of go into the questions or comments section of the webinar. So as I indicated earlier, if you have a question, you can type that in the question feature in your panel on the side of your screen there. And I just wanted to kind of build on a couple of things that Ada said real quickly while we're waiting for some questions to come in. You know, as a non-tribal probation officer, it's very important to figure out ways to be creative and ways that you can build in culture into working with Native Americans on your supervision caseloads. And there's some ways that you can do that. There's some jurisdictions that are looking at maybe swapping out community service hours for participation in culturally based programs that they have vetted with the tribe. So I know one jurisdiction that has swapped out the community service hours for participation in their tribal language program. So that's kind of a creative way to make sure that these folks are getting connected back to maybe something that's very important to them. And so the other thing is really to be, Ada stressed kind of the importance of maybe developing a tribal profile for the tribal communities that you work with. And that's really important, and it can really aid in the supervision process to become aware of what may be meaningful for a tribe. You know, practices that happen during funeral or mourning ceremonies. You know, I know there's some tribes that their mourning periods are a week all the way up to a month. And so what does that mean for supervision? Are there things that you just need to be aware of while they're on supervision? And then also you have to, you know, the flip side of that is knowing maybe when someone's trying to get away with something by saying it's tribally or culturally important, or this is the way that their tribe does it. So that's, you know, you have to kind of know that for both reasons. So we'll look here. Again, if you have any questions, you can type that in the comment section or in the questions section there. So we have one question that's come in, and maybe Ada, you can address that. Are there suggestions that you have for maybe asking a tribe to share with you as a probation officer a little bit about their culture, or are there ways of asking them kind of what's important for you to know as a probation officer if you're supervising members from their tribe on supervision? So Ada, do you have some suggestions for ways somebody could go about doing that?
Well, I think one of the really important things to convey to a tribe is that that officers want to use culture as a resource. First of all, it's just to explain to them how the use of culture is not prohibited from a rehabilitation plan. And so I think a lot of times tribes are not sure where or why they're being asked to share cultural information, what kind of cultural information they're being asked. And if I would start by just saying, this is what we want to do. We want to be able to use culture as a resource. We want to, our client has been incarcerated or would like to participate in different healing resources. What are those things that he or she can participate in? What are the, and if there's a language barrier for your client, I think sometimes that's important for us to know, just so that we know how comfortable the person is in participating in the tribe's culture. And so these are things that I think ahead of time we can find out, but I think it's really important to just really convey why we want to be able to use culture as a resource and not something that is prohibiting. And the reason, one of the other big reasons why is so that we can guide our client in terms of there may be things that they need to do themselves to get them to be able to use a cultural resource. There may be, like in some tribes, they might need to present themselves again to the tribe, to the tribal leadership, to say who they are, what family they come from, and these are things that there may be tribal protocols in place that we're not familiar with, and that's one of the reasons why we want to talk to the tribe, is so that we can get guidance from them.
Okay. So, Ada, another question is there a point of contact for a tribe that a probation officer can use to start asking questions about the services that a tribe has that may be accessed during the supervision period? Would you recommend, say, contacting an elder or contacting tribal council or the tribal probation colleague if the tribe has a probation agency? Do you have recommendations for that?
That's a really good question, because each tribe has its own gatekeepers, as I call them. But a good place to start is just finding out from the tribal government. First of all, do your homework, do the tribal profile, find out what the government structure is like. A lot of tribes have tribal administrators these days, and so you can talk to them and ask them who would be the best person to talk to. And then if you get an internal referral to like a probation office or to tribes that don't have probation offices, sometimes they'll point you towards the social services program or some kind of helping agency, behavioral health or somebody like that. And so I would start with somebody like, maybe not the governor or the president or the chief's office, but somebody like an administrative type person. Explain what you need and have them guide you internally, so that then heavily name drop. The tribal administrator appointed me to you, said that you will be able to help me with identifying, and again, always explain your purpose. So that people understand why you're asking for their guidance.
Okay, great. Another question that came in is there a list anywhere with the numbers of Native Americans in prison systems and probation programs? And I'll just kind of start out talking about this, and Brian, you may have some information on this if you're still on the line. I know, speaking from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and I don't know how, I know state and local facilities do this differently, but typically they catalog whether somebody has self-identified as Native American or Alaska Native, but they do not get down to the level of indicating the tribe that they belong to. And so this has become a real issue for reentry purposes. It's a real barrier for tribes not knowing where their members are housed at, and also getting notification of when their members are going to be released from these facilities. So that's a big issue. But I think if you look at the statistics for any, you can go to the Federal Bureau of Prisons website, and they do annual updates of people in prison. But again, it's really just going to capture whether somebody self-identifies as Native American or Alaska Native. As far as probation, I know there are annual surveys of people on probation. And again, it's going to be the same type of situation where somebody just self-identifies as that. So Brian, I don't know if you're still on the line, if you want to speak to the probation piece.
I think he had to drop off and go back to his event.
Okay. So yeah, Brian he's actually on the road training, so he had to pop off the line. Another question is there a list of tribal nations that have a probation program in place? And I know the Bureau of Justice Assistance does a tribal justice survey, and I think there was one that just went out last year. To my knowledge, I don't think those results have been made public yet, but I do know that historically there's not been questions on that survey specific to probation specifically, but I know on this year's survey there were specific questions about whether a tribal justice agency has a probation program. So hopefully that data will be coming out soon. But APPA does try to we try to capture, as we're out providing training and technical assistance, we do try to collect that information as much as we can about whether a tribe has a probation program. So we have a list, but it's I would gather to say that it's not a comprehensive list of every tribal community that has a probation program. So another question is, Adrienne, I think this is directed at you. They would love the manual on Native American motivational interviewing. So can you, I know we provided a link on the slides for how to get that, but maybe you can provide some further information on that.
Yeah, if anyone is interested, they can certainly email me directly. And I think we maybe have our contact information maybe on the last slide, or if not, we can get that out to everyone. And I can also share some other additional resources, some of the articles that we cited in our article.
Okay, great.
I think another, Kim, just to add to the list of folks that have in the jails in Indian Country, there's a list of the agencies that have jails or detention facilities. It's not a given that they have probation, but a lot of tribes that do have these facilities tend to have probation. And there's a list, but not a contact information.
Right, and the publication that you're referencing, Ada, speaks to tribes that have their own detention facilities.
Right.
So yeah, that would be another good place to get some of that information. Thank you. Okay, those are all the questions that I think have come in so far. So we just want to thank you all for being a part of this webinar today. As I said, it was recorded, and we'll have it popped up on the website here in a couple of days. So if you want to share it with anybody or recommend, staff or colleagues take a look at this. We'll also be sending out the PowerPoint materials, so you will have all the information that was presented today, including we'll stick in the presenter's contact information so that if you have specific questions that maybe you want to reach out to Adrienne or Brian or Ada or myself, we'll make sure that you have their contact information to do that. And then as always, if you have any follow-up questions or need any direction to point yourself to resources or materials, or if you're looking for further training and technical assistance on any of these issues, please feel free to contact myself at APPA. We're always here to be a reference for you as you strive to work with justice-involved Native American and Alaska Natives in your communities. So with that, we will sign off for today, and thank you all very much for participating.